Welcome to Straight From The Coil, the metal detecting podcast about more than just what comes out of the ground. We talk detecting, gear, mindset, lessons from the field, and the things that help you become a better detectorist. I'm David, and this is Straight From The Coil. Okay, so today I want to talk about something that I see all the time, especially with new detectorists, and that is the idea that better finds are sitting behind a better detector. Now, I've made this mistake myself, but I try to help people who are new to the hobby avoid these mistakes in the beginning. A better detector can absolutely give you more capability, but before you spend a bunch of money on another machine, it's worth asking whether the detector is really the problem or whether you just need more time with the detector you already own. So that's the topic for today. Let's get into it. One thing you want to think about is, why do we usually start blaming the detector? And I did this myself again. That's why I'm speaking from experience here. But think about that point where your find started slowing down, or that day that you went out and you dug so much trash and didn't find anything good, and you start wondering if the machine is holding you back. And that's a natural response. That's a natural feeling, to that situation. And it kind of gets you into this temptation of, I really need to upgrade. And, it doesn't help. Today, in today's world of metal detecting, there are so many choices out there for detectors, way more so than there were in the past. And it doesn't make it any easier when you've got a lot of the companies releasing new machines frequently, so it's very tempting to upgrade. Aside from that, you see, YouTube reviews, you see YouTube videos. Of course, when new detectors come out, everybody wants to review them and talk about how good they are. And some people talk about how bad they are. But in a general sense, they want to debut it and let everyone know about it, right? So you see it on YouTube, you see it in social media posts, Facebook. And then sometimes the first thing you see is the person takes this new machine or the upgraded machine out, and they're making great finds with it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the machine did that. That's one thing we got to keep in mind throughout this whole discussion here. So you have to ask yourself, if you're considering upgrading, what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve here? Are you really lacking depth, separation? Do you need waterproofing or some other feature? Or have you just had a few frustrating hunts? You really need to dig deep and ask yourself that question. Because the simple fact of the matter, and it took me a while to realize this, is that the detector that you already own, or the one that you're using, it has to become familiar to you. And it almost has to become like second nature. And you really need to put a lot of hours into that one machine to start learning it. And the more hours you put in, the more certain sounds and behaviors start becoming recognizable to you. You just really need to put that time in. Now, on the subject of VDIs, let's talk about that a little bit. They're useful. That is a feature on your detector that can be very helpful at times. But it isn't the whole story, okay? Because you really need to learn about the tones and the sounds that the detector makes. And I say VDI is just, it's part of the picture, part of the whole story. The numbers can jump because of depth, orientation of the target, any trash or anything nearby that might be masking that target, the soil conditions, the shape of the target. There's all sorts of things that can affect that VDI number. So tones matter a lot more than most people realize in the beginning. And I didn't realize this when I started, but, you know, two targets can show similar numbers, but sound completely different once you start learning the tones and the audio and you start listening close. You can tell that there's a difference. So focus on the audio. Every hunt that you go on, focus on that audio, the sound, and make a note. Once you dig that target, how was it laying in the dirt? What was the orientation? You know, if it's a coin, was it flat? Was it on its edge? Was it tilted? Was there any other trash in the hole around this coin? You know, was the coin bent? You know, so there's all sorts of things to keep in mind with the target itself in the ground. And, you know, soil conditions. Did it rain yesterday? Is it super dry? Is it rocky? Is it mineralized? All of these things have an effect on your target tones and the VDI numbers. So don't always hang your hat on a VDI. It's not the whole story. It's only part of it. And if you really pay attention to the tones and also, you know, look at your VDI numbers, after enough time, some of your targets are going to start developing their own personality, and you'll start recognizing patterns. Bottle caps, foil, pull tabs, deep coins, bent trash. Put enough time in on that detector, and you're going to start seeing the differences. And one thing that does for you when you're out there hunting is it starts to build confidence. And confidence changes how you hunt. When you start trusting your machine and you spend less time second guessing every signal and you spend more time making good decisions about the targets, your confidence starts to build, and that goes a long way. And to be able to do this, you really need to put the time in. Anytime you can get out and hunt with that machine, go do it. I always recommend your own yard. If you own your property and there's no problems with you getting on it, or even if you rent, if your landlord gives you permission to hunt on that property, your yard can be one of the best learning sites for metal detecting, because many times it's got a mixture of almost everything in it. You can have trash, you know, pull tabs, bottle caps, scraps of aluminum, nails, different iron targets, coins, pieces of furniture, screws, you name it, it can be in your yard. And you can actually find some pretty cool stuff there if you go out. So here's the thing about upgrading when you really don't need to. And this first one is definitely, I felt the pain on this one. And that was constantly changing detectors. And I actually went through, I got to the point where I owned 3 detectors before I realized this. And what I realized was constantly changing detectors, it's going to slow you down, because every detector you use is going to mean new tones, new numbers, new settings, and just basically new quirks, you know, for that particular detector. The only time you may not run into this so much would be, for example, if you're using a Mind Lab detector and you kind of stay within that realm, your tones are going to sound pretty much the same. But if you're switching brands, this is definitely going to come into play. You could be switching from a detector that has a VDI scale up to 99 and switching to one that only goes up to 60, or vice versa. You know, new numbers, new sounds, new quirks. So, and different settings. So that's one, thing that can slow you down is constantly changing your detector. And the other thing too is a more expensive detector is not going to guarantee you more fines. I fell into this trap too. And, someone that really knows inside and out, a mid-range detector can easily outperform someone that's using an expensive one that they barely understand. You could take that person that knows that one detector inside and out against someone with a very expensive detector that has not learned how to use it, and they're going to get beat. It's just pretty much the way it is. So that's another thing to think about. And again, I made that mistake. I jumped from an Ace 200 to an Xterra Pro, MindLab Xterra Pro. And from the Xterra Pro, I jumped all the way into an XP 2. So, big difference in price range on those. But in my mind, I was telling myself, better detector equals better fines, and I was wrong. So, I've made that mistake. Now, those detectors are really good. Once you learn them, they're good. They're great. Since that time, I have learned to use the XP 2 a lot better than when I first bought it. And again, that comes with time. And going back to that, when I think of, especially with the Xterra Pro, I didn't spend a lot of time with the Ace 200 before I jumped to the Xterra Pro, but I spent a ton of time using the MindLab Xterra Pro. And, I had a really good grasp on that machine, and it got to a point to where I could pretty much call the targets. I knew what I was digging when I dug it. Now, did I get skunked sometimes? Of course. You can't do it 100% of the time, but I knew that detector so well and spent enough time with it that it was my go-to, and I was finding all sorts of things with that detector. And I found my first silver with the Xterra Pro. The first ring I ever found was with the Xterra Pro. And the list goes on. I found several things with that detector. However, it got into my mind at some point when I was having, a few bad days or a bad week, I decided that it wasn't good enough anymore. And, I jumped to the XP 2. Didn't spend a lot of time with it, but got out there with it. And I was still digging trash. Somewhere in my mind, I guess I told myself, hey, if I get this, I'll dig less trash. But that's not the case. You will dig plenty of trash with a Deus 2, an Xterra Pro, an Elite, an Equinox. You're going to dig trash. That's just the way it is. So, I mean, it even got to a point with the Deus 2 where I got so frustrated with it, I grabbed my Xterra Pro, walked out the door with that, and I immediately started finding good targets. So, same side I had been on with the Deus 2, I went back and I found good stuff. And that's because I really knew that Xterra Pro a lot more so than I did the XP 2. Now, in talking about this, I'll say this. I'm not like anti-upgrade by any means. I think there are legitimate reasons to upgrade. If you're looking for a detector that's lighter, better ergonomics, or let's say you've got one that's not waterproof and you find yourself doing a lot of water hunting, so you need to get a waterproof detector, Or you might find one that has more options for recovery or reactivity speed where you can get more separation out of it. Maybe there's more coil options with one model than there is another. You know, there are reasons to upgrade, but in the beginning, my advice is to stick with what you got until you learn it. Don't upgrade because you've had a lot of bad hunts or you're just bored with that detector. Upgrade because there's a need. You know, if that new detector solves a real problem that you have, that's different from simply just, oh, I want the newest machine. Give it some time. Go out with your current detector. Give it some intentional time and learn more and more. Dig those questionable targets. Pay attention to the audio. Notice what happens around the trash. Learn how the machine behaves on the ground that you're hunting. Because your ground that you hunt is going to be different from the ground I hunt, or the guy on YouTube hunts, or the next guy that's 3 states over is hunting. It's going to be different. So you need to get out with yours and see how it reacts. So a detector becomes much more powerful when you understand it well enough to trust it. The machine matters, but your experience with that machine matters just as much. So I'm going to wrap it up right here. I could ramble on for probably a little while longer, but I'm going to wrap it up. And I just want to leave you with one closing thought. And that is, before you decide you need a better detector, ask yourself one question. Have I really learned the one I already have? Sometimes the next step isn't a new machine. Sometimes it's another 100 hours with the one that's already in your hands. And that's going to be it for this episode. Thanks for listening to Straight From The Coil. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the show so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, keep learning your machine, trust what you're hearing, and remember, sometimes all it takes is one good find to make the whole hunt worthwhile.